Welcome to Casual Politics. Malcolm, thank you very much. This is not your first time with Casual Politics. If I may be right, this is your third time with Casual Politics.
One more than I remember.
Yeah, and the first time I came into your office in Portcullis House, and we had a very interesting conversation together. So do you miss your time in Parliament?
Not at all. I enjoyed it enormously, but life is a series of phases, and that includes public life as well. So some things you enjoy enormously, events move on, and you have other experiences, and that's what I'm doing. So I've had, throughout my life, I was worked in Africa for a while. I worked as a barrister for 4 years full time, then as a member of Parliament, minister for 18 years, which was far too long, in opposition, but in the private sector, came back into Parliament, served as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, and now I'm a free man at last. It's like the chap in Fidelio, Beethoven's opera, who comes blinking out of the cell, enjoying his new freedom.
Over summer, you published your fascinating memoirs called Power and Pragmatism. So are you a proud, pragmatic statesman?
Well, I think if you read the introduction to the book, you will see that I point out that there's two kinds of politicians. There's the conviction politician, there's the pragmatist. And the conviction politician, somebody like Margaret Thatcher is the obvious example, could be very pragmatic when it suited her. But equally, pragmatists do have convictions. It's a question of emphasis. It's whether when you're having to deal with a serious problem, whether you automatically go to a formula of specific beliefs that you hold and try not to depart from them, or whether, as I and many others do, you try to say, well, how do we solve this problem? And you hope it will fit into your prior assumptions and prejudices, but you don't get too upset if it requires you to depart from them.
And in your memoirs, you write that you were always very fascinated about the current affairs and especially foreign affairs. So could we say that the trip, it's because mainly of the trip that you had with your school and you crossed India and then you went...
Well, that was at university, not
Yes.
at school.
Yes.
But in a sense, there's a whole range of explanations as to what makes any of us fascinated by certain things and which may influence our future public life. In my own case, I grew up in the 1960s and early 1970s, and that was a time when the British Empire was finally disappearing. All our previous colonies in Africa and the West Indies and the Pacific and the Caribbean were all becoming independent countries. So each week, it seemed, a new nation was being formed. And as a young teenager, I was just fascinated by that. I had a map on the wall of all the countries with the new political boundaries that they had, and it just was something that seemed more interesting than collecting postage stamps. And so that really gave me an interest in foreign politics and what was happening in the world. And I've really always, in my political life, been much more interested in international politics than domestic. I'm interested in domestic issues. They're very, very important. Some of my cabinet jobs were on Transport Department or the Scottish Office, were very domestic, but the real passion has been foreign policy.
At Edinburgh University, you became very prominent for your speeches, and then you went on in Parliament as well to make some of the most powerful speeches that even Margaret Thatcher praised you for them. So what makes a speech powerful?
Well, there's two kinds of speaker who can be commented on. There are those who are the great orators, who have great passion, who have great enthusiasm, who have tremendous use of language, Winston Churchill being the most obvious example, but there are others of that kind. I don't really fit into that category. Insofar as I have been reasonably successful as a public speaker, it is more addressing an issue, analysing a problem, going through the various arguments and reaching a conclusion. And I've trained myself over the years to do that, not by reading a text, but by having determined in advance the broad structure of my speech, the beginning, the middle and the end, and then allowing myself to adapt during the course of the speech to the audience I'm speaking to the interests, the interventions, and therefore giving it a spontaneity which makes it much more interesting for the speaker. Now, if you are making a speech without a text, There's two advantages of that. One is that the audience tend to be impressed if you get away with it, but it's even more important if you're a minister, because when a minister reads a speech, the assumption is not just that he needs a written text, but that he didn't even write it himself. The assumption will be, sometimes unfairly, but often very fairly, that it's been written for him by his civil servants, by his officials. So when I became a minister, I was determined to avoid a text wherever possible, not just to show off, though I don't mind showing off if one can get away with it, but it was also to demonstrate to my civil servants and to the public as a whole that this was a minister who actually understood what he was doing, who was in control of his department, and therefore could speak without a formal text written by civil servants. It made my civil servants very nervous, particularly in the Ministry of Defence. They were worried I might declare war on somebody without consulting them first, but fortunately that never happened.
And who were the most powerful orators back in your time in Parliament when you entered in 1974?
Well, you can sometimes have some brilliant orators. It doesn't necessarily correspond to their political success. I mean, the most obvious example I can think of is Enoch Powell, who was in the House of Commons for a good number of years when I became an MP. And whenever he got up to speak in the chamber of the House of Commons, and people saw his name on the monitor in some other part of the parliamentary estate, the chamber would quite quickly fill because people wanted to come and hear. But the tragedy for Enoch Powell was they came to hear, they didn't come to listen. And there's an important distinction. They came to hear what they knew would be an exceptional speech, but he rarely, if ever, convinced anyone, because he had so many personal idiosyncrasies, not just on the question of race relations and matters of that kind for which he is most remembered, but on a whole range of issues, including Northern Ireland. And he would start by declaring some premise. For example, in Northern Ireland, the whole problems of Northern Ireland were because the American Irish, the Boston Irish, were determined to be anti-British, or something of that kind. And if you accepted his premise, then you had to accept most of the rest of what he said. But it didn't quite work like that. It was once said in the 1930s about a similar politician that it said that the right honourable gentleman has such a logical frame of mind that starting with a false premise, he moves inexorably to the wrong conclusion. That's the problem of logic. And Enoch Powell was a bit like that.
But do you think that it's healthy for democracy to have controversial figures like in the 30s we had Oswald Mosley's, in the 70s we had Enoch Powell's, and in the 2000s we had George Galloway's. Do you think that that's healthy for a democracy to have people who speak out against establishment?
If you want a straight yes or no answer, yes, the answer has to be yes, it is very, very healthy. But it's not a question of choosing such people. Such people present themselves. They are, by the sheer force of their personality, they become public figures. And in the examples you've mentioned, they become members of Parliament because people have elected them in a particular constituency. Sometimes, like Nigel Farage, they cannot get elected to the House of Commons, but they still have a big impact on public opinion, also by the sheer force of their personality.
And shortly after your entrance into Parliament, you were promoted to the front bench. However, in your memoirs you write that Margaret Thatcher was always wary of you, that you were not one of us, and she regarded you as one of the Reds. So do you still regard yourself as a Thatcherite?
Well, I was never a Thatcherite in the sense that phrase implies, because most people who think of themselves as Thatcherites were devoted admirers of Margaret Thatcher and believed that she was never wrong, or so rarely wrong that you hardly needed to comment on it. I had a slightly more ambiguous relationship. Do you wish to stop till that noise stops?
No.
I had a more ambiguous relationship with Margaret Thatcher. I thought she was a superb Prime Minister. I felt myself incredibly privileged to be part of her cabinet. 3/4 of the time I could have followed her anywhere. The other quarter I could not. We differed, and it wasn't on foreign policy issues when I was a minister in the Foreign Office under Geoffrey Howe. There, Margaret Thatcher and I agreed on most of what we were dealing with. I thought she was right in most of these matters. It was on Scotland, on Scottish matters. And if I had to sum up the differences that I had with her, she, quite rightly, believed that I was Scotland's, the cabinet's man in Scotland, representing the cabinet in Scotland. I had to point out to her that that was true, but I was also Scotland's man in the cabinet. That if you are a territorial Secretary of State, in the days before devolution, Secretary of State for Scotland, for Wales, for Northern Ireland, then you had an additional responsibility compared to other cabinet ministers. You were the champion of the country you were representing in the cabinet, and that didn't mean you always went along with what Scots or the Welsh or the Irish were demanding. You had to use your own judgment. But if you judged that what they were requesting or seeking or demanding was not unreasonable, was indeed fair, then you had to try and do your best to deliver that. Margaret Thatcher didn't enjoy that. She didn't approve of it, and she distrusted those who took that view.
But you also, at the Scottish office, you had a fallout with Michael Forsyth, and who was a leading member in the Scottish office. So how did the public perceive that, and did they...
Well, you say I had a fallout with Michael Forsyth. That's not quite what happened, but I know what you're getting at.
Yeah.
First of all, Michael Forsyth was my junior minister. He was an extremely good minister. I never had any problems with him as a minister. But it goes back to what you said earlier. He was a very committed Thatcherite. He thought the light shone out of her eyes. And when I had my differences with Margaret Thatcher over Scottish policy, he invariably took her side. And now he was entitled to have that view, but not when it started becoming public, when it started becoming a public matter, or if he, as a junior minister, went slightly behind my back to 10 Downing Street. That created problems. So we did have a difficulty at that time, particularly as she had made him chairman of the party in Scotland against my advice, and that turned out, from the party's point of view, to be a very unwise decision. Within a year, she had to ask him to stand down because of many problems. Now, having made all these comments, I wish to add that since then, Michael Forsyth and I have become good friends. He was a very good Secretary of State for Scotland some years later, and although we don't agree on everything, we get on very, very well at a personal level. Now, I think on this he would agree with me.
And also, the first speaker in your time, it was Selwyn Lloyd. Do you think the stature of speakership has diminished since John Bercow has taken office?
Well, it certainly changed. I don't think even his most fervent admirer would compare John Bercow as being of the same stature as Selwyn Lloyd. But it's not just Selwyn Lloyd. I mean, I was privileged to see in the Speaker's chair some very impressive speakers. George Thomas, for example.
Bernard Weatherall.
And Jack Weatherall also. They were all good speakers. And John Bercow, I have a mixed judgment on. In many respects, he's actually a very, very good speaker. He's a strong defender of the backbenchers. He stands up to government, whether it's a Labour government or a Conservative government. Ministers can't just assume they'll get priority, and that's what the Speaker's there to do. But I think there is a downside to the way he's handled his responsibilities. When George Thomas was Speaker, George Thomas, like John Bercow, would use a great deal of humour to try and calm the House of Commons or to try and get an unruly MP to behave himself. John Bercow also uses humour, but it's a different kind of humour. He tends to belittle the MP in question, make him feel very small, some very unpleasant comments as well as funny comments at his expense. George Thomas, when he was Speaker, never did that. He used humour at his own expense. He created a lightness of touch which calmed the House of Commons and got MPs to behave properly. So I think John Bercow has not chosen the right method in that particular area. But in terms of his competence, he's a very able guy indeed.
And what do you make of banning Donald Trump to come and deliver a speech in Westminster Hall?
Well, I don't think the Speaker's job is to express an opinion on that at this stage, and certainly not in public. The Speaker has to be completely neutral. It's not the Speaker's personal preferences that should determine matters of state. If the government of the day have decided there should be a state visit from a prominent head of state of another country, then it is a question as to whether he should be invited to address Houses of Parliament, and the Speaker is perfectly entitled, in private, when these matters are being discussed, to indicate his view as to whether the House of Commons would welcome that. Of course, Speaker of the House of Lords has a similar right to offer his view, and then a decision is reached. So I think it was very unwise for Speaker Bercow simply to give his own personal opinions on such a sensitive matter so early in the stage. We don't even know when President Trump is going to arrive in the United Kingdom, so there was no need to have that little outburst as we sadly had a week or so ago.
And as a former foreign secretary, are you worried that Donald Trump now will declare war to Estonia, to some Baltic states? And how do you think that the UK government got to react to his actions?
Well, like pretty well everybody else, I was appalled when it became clear that Donald Trump was going to become president of the United States, because he's obviously the least qualified person to do the most important job in the world that we have seen ever, not just in recent times. Now, that's pretty alarming stuff because of the powers available to the president. Of course, from a British point of view, our main interest is his foreign policy, not his domestic issues. And what's already emerging is a very interesting distinction. Because Trump's background is a businessman, on domestic issues of jobs in the United States, of trade, of economic policy, he thinks he knows all the answers. He's not really listening very much to the advice he receives, and he's going to do, it would appear, much as he indicated he was likely to do when he was running for president. Foreign policy, it's rather different. What we have already seen in a whole range of areas is the president drawing back from what he said during the campaign and being much more responsible and much more mainstream in his opinions. So now he says he's 100% behind NATO. Now he is warning the Israelis that they shouldn't build more settlements in the West Bank, and pushing into the long grass the question of whether the American embassy should be moved to Jerusalem. Now he's reassuring the Chinese that he does believe in a one China policy and is not going to recognize Taiwan. He's not encouraging the Japanese to build their own nuclear weapons to deal with North Korea. So all of that is pretty good stuff. And in a sense, I think the distinction is not that surprising. The economic issues that I mentioned earlier, that all relates to his core vote, the people who voted for him, who are primarily interested in economic issues and jobs and trade and matters of that kind. So he's not going to budge from that. On foreign policy, he has prejudices, he has instincts, which we heard during the campaign, but he knows that he's not expert in these areas, and thankfully it would appear that he is taking advice and accepting that advice and modifying his views.
And as a moderate Eurosceptic, that's what you describe yourself in your memoirs.
That's what Le Monde described me as, a Eurosceptic modéré, which sounds as good in French as it does in English.
Absolutely. So were you satisfied when Donald Trump announced that the UK would go at the front of the queue and not at the back?
Well, it is obviously preferable that the United States should attach as much importance to a new free trade agreement between the United Kingdom and the United States as we do. And so, yes, I was very pleased when he made it clear that was his objective. Of course, such a free trade agreement can't come into effect until we leave the EU, which is not going to be before 2019. The importance of what he has said is that the diplomats and the negotiators in both the US and the UK can now get to work. They can spend the next 2 years working out what will be the content of such an agreement, even though it cannot come into effect until we cease to be a member of the EU.
And as you may know, the UK has embraced multiculturalism since the 1970s. And when Donald Trump made his controversial policies and comments, this nation, they were taken back from his comments. So, and what do you make of Theresa May holding his hands when he banned some of the UK nationals to go to the US?
Hold on. I think you're juxtaposing various events. It didn't quite happen in that way. She didn't hold his hand when he announced a policy on refugees. They were coming down a sloping pathway when she was visiting him in the United States. And for about 3 seconds, He held her hand, whether in friendship or to help his balance, I do not know, but I wouldn't draw any geopolitical conclusions from that rather minor act of friendship. But to make a more substantive response to your points, on the question of the refugee announcement, I think the British government has been quite right to say that we strongly disagree with his announcement, and of course so do the American courts, and so does most of the world. It's worth reminding people who may have forgotten that the close, friendly relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States has never required us to automatically agree with everything American presidents say or do. Most British prime ministers, probably with the exception of Tony Blair, have had big disagreements with the American president of the day without it damaging the overall relationship. Harold Wilson refused to send troops to Vietnam, despite Lyndon Johnson wanting him to. Margaret Thatcher had serious rows with Ronald Reagan, both over nuclear weapons and over the invasion of Grenada, of a very, very strong kind. John Major disagreed with Bill Clinton about bombing in use of NATO airstrikes in Bosnia. So Blair was the exception. Blair seemed to believe that unless he was hand in glove with George Bush, which he was over Iraq, that somehow the relationship would be damaged. That was a sign of Blair's immaturity and lack of judgment, rather than typical of other British prime ministers.
And the EU coordinator who will negotiate our terms from exiting the European Union is Michel Barnier, whom I suppose that you
I knew him slightly. I don't know more,
back in
but
your
I met
time.
him.
So do you think that he's a plus to our negotiation deals with the EU?
Well, let's be clear. Michel Barnier hasn't been given sort of plenipotentiary powers. He will not determine the terms or the conditions or the compromises that may be necessary. That will be decided by the European Union heads of government, the 27 countries, but mainly, obviously, Germany, France, and the other larger countries. So Barnier will do the detailed work, as will, for example, David Davis on the United Kingdom side. David Davis is not going to be the person who decides the policy. The policy will be decided by the cabinet, and in particular, obviously, the Prime Minister, Theresa May. So it's going to be a similar situation.
And the Prime Minister said that it's not a binary choice to stay, to have access to the single market or to remain a member of customs union.
Let me comment on that. I mean, first of all, where am I coming from? I voted Remain. I didn't do so primarily for economic reasons or internal market reasons, although I strongly support the internal market, and I'm rather sad that we're going to be leaving it. But my main concern why I voted for Remain was that, with all its manifest faults, I believe that the creation of a European Union in Europe, where 2 world wars began, is a great historic achievement. And what worries me is that the decision of the United Kingdom to leave is the beginning of a process of fragmentation, which could lead to the collapse of the European Union, which, as the British government itself has said, is not something that we want. So I'm concerned about that, and I think we will lose more than we will gain by leaving. But am I desolate? No, I'm not desolate. In terms of the economy, in terms of trade and the internal market, Britain is a very large, successful economy. It's an economy which can easily survive our departure from the European Union. There will be some advantages, there will be some disadvantages. And even in the case of the City of London, the City of London was along with New York, was one of the 2 great global financial capitals long before we joined the European Union, and will remain with that status long number of years after we've left.
And in your memoirs, you're quite worried about the 3 musketeers, mainly Boris Johnson. You write that he needs to now balance out the role of being a statesman and the role of being a politician, and also Liam Fox and David Davis, who served you as your junior ministers.
Well, they're all 3 of them. I do know all 3 of them.
Yes.
2 of them, as you say, served as my junior ministers, Liam Fox and David Davis, and Boris Johnson I've known for years. They're all very, very able people, no question about it. Boris Johnson has not got the direct responsibility for the European matters. He's dealing with the rest of the world. He could be an excellent foreign secretary. He's a highly intelligent man. He has very moderate views on a whole range of issues, and a very remarkable personality, to put it mildly. The point that obviously has concerned people is that his global celebrity has been based on his wit and in his ability to make pretty scathing and headline-catching remarks about various world leaders over the years. As Foreign Secretary, he can't enjoy that luxury. Foreign Secretaries, Harold Macmillan once memorably said, foreign secretaries are either dull or dangerous. Well, Boris certainly isn't dull, and we must be satisfied he won't be dangerous. I think so far he's doing pretty well. I mean, I think so far he's realised what the job requires, and we are seeing a new Boris, different Boris, perhaps a slightly duller Boris, but that can't be helped if the job's to be done properly. So far as the other two are concerned, David Davis and Liam Fox, they're very different people, and we will see over the next few months the extent to which their skills are going to be successful in delivering what is required.
And Boris Johnson, he made some controversial comments over the Saudi role in the Middle East, and he said that they're causing proxy wars. Is that how you perceive the role of the Saudis in that region back in your time?
Well, of course, shortly after he made these comments, he actually visited Saudi Arabia, and what he said when he was there was slightly more diplomatic, shall we say, and was fully in accordance with British policy. I think the reality, whoever is Foreign Secretary, is that we can't just have good diplomatic relations with the countries whose political systems are the same as ours. The most obvious example of what I'm saying, of course, was during the Second World War, when Churchill and Roosevelt achieved a very close alliance with Joseph Stalin. And they didn't have any illusions about Stalin or about communist Soviet Union. They knew that it was a despotic power, but the overriding priority was to defeat Hitler and the Nazi occupation of Europe. And it worked. While there may be things in Saudi Arabia or other countries that we disapprove of, and there are, that is not a reason why we can't have a close diplomatic relationship with them, where we have common threats that we are subject to, and common interests as regards a range of other policies.
Two last quick questions. Firstly, is that now the Parliament overwhelmingly has voted to exit from the European Union. What role, and then Scotland, probably they want another referendum.
No, don't say Scotland wants. There's no evidence that Scotland wants another referendum. 60% of Scots say they don't want another referendum. Mrs Sturgeon and the SNP might want one. They are not Scotland. You must not use these two terms as if they are the same people.
But there is a risk of losing Scotland, and so following the vote to leave the European Union. So what role do you foresee for the United Kingdom as a whole following our exit from the European Union?
Well, I think that 2 points, if I may. First of all, I think Mrs Sturgeon is a very smart lady, and I don't think she wants a referendum at all. Not because she doesn't want independence for Scotland, but because she knows she'd lose a referendum. There would be a second victory for the Unionist position if the referendum was held. And what she knows is that winning a referendum in Scotland would be actually much more difficult now, even than it was 2 or 3 years ago when they lost it quite heavily. And why would it be more difficult? Partly because of the collapse of the oil price. There's now a huge budgetary gap of billions of pounds, which would mean that independent Scotland would either have to have much higher taxes or massive cuts in government spending compared to the United Kingdom. But in addition to that, what is the point of leaving the United Kingdom in order to enjoy the European single market, to whom Scotland exports 20% of its output, and thereby ceasing to be part of the United Kingdom single market, because that's what the United Kingdom is, where Scotland exports 60% of its output. The reason why Scotland and England joined together in 1707, there were a variety of reasons, but one of the most important from the Scottish point of view was to get access to England and England's much larger economy. They didn't call it in those days an internal market, but that is in practice what it was. So far as the wider question of Scotland and the United Kingdom is concerned, I have a great deal of time for what George Osborne did with what's known as the Northern Powerhouse, decentralising control of huge sums of resources to the north of England. And why do I say that? It's because part of the Scottish nationalist argument is somehow Scotland is different, so different from the rest of the United Kingdom, it should break away and become a separate state. What we have seen in practice over the last 20 years is that the United Kingdom has been reinventing itself. Instead of being a highly centralised country with everything run by London and Westminster, we now have a very powerful devolved Scottish Parliament. We have a Welsh Assembly, not as powerful as the Scottish Parliament, but growing in its importance and significance. In Northern Ireland, we have institutionalised power sharing between the two communities there, written into the law. And now in England, we are getting not regional parliaments, because the English don't want that in various regions of England, but real decentralisation or devolution of power from Whitehall to the regions. So what that, in my view, means is that the United Kingdom, in a very British way, is stumbling towards a new union, a union which has devolution or decentralisation for Scotland, for Wales, for Northern Ireland, for the regions of England, but it's not uniform. It's in different ways, reflecting the different needs and aspirations of Scots, the Welsh, the Irish, and the people of the regions of England. And that's why Britain will survive. It's also worth remembering the United Kingdom's an island, and islands tend to have a more homogeneous, a more uniform set of values. And in that sense, leaving the European Union actually probably makes people in Scotland as well as in England and in Wales feel slightly more British, you know. We're having to carve a new position for ourselves in the world, and it reminds people of what we have in common within the United Kingdom that remains powerfully relevant to most people's lives.
And should we abolish the second chamber if they reject the rule, the democratic rule of the British people?
Well, the question, I think it would be very foolish to not have a second chamber. You need to have a revising chamber of parliament, because it curbs government from doing silly things from time to time. I don't think there is the slightest possibility of the House of Lords refusing to give approval to Article 50 permitting the negotiations on Britain's departure. Of course the House of Lords understands. We had a referendum, the public took a decision, the House of Commons has endorsed that overwhelmingly, the House of Lords is not going to block it. I think that some of the alarmist stuff we've heard recently looks great in headlines but doesn't relate to the real world.
And lastly, the final question. Tony Benn once said that I was once a national threat and now I'm a national treasure. As you risk becoming a national treasure yourself quite soon, would you like to be remembered after serving 50 years in the public service?
Well, I don't particularly have any aspirations to be either a national treasure, nor do I fear being a national threat. I'll just settle, if I can, for being a national asset.
On that note, thank you very much, Malcolm. Thank you very much for accepting my request. Thank you.